know there is a bill that is supposed to lock you up in jail? Yes. Or you pay 100,000 naira should you fail to just vote. Aha. But don't be afraid. Let's break it down for you. Well, the Socio-Economic Rights and Accountability Project, otherwise known as SERAP, has called on Senate President Godswill Akpabio and House Speaker Tajuddin Abbas to withdraw a proposed bill that seeks to impose a 6-month jail term or 100,000 naira fine on eligible Nigerians who fail to vote in elections.
The organization described the bill as oppressive and a violation of citizens' rights under the Nigerian Constitution and international human rights laws. The bill, titled Bill for an Act to Amend the Electoral Act 2022 to make it mandatory for all Nigerians of majority age to vote in all national and state elections and for related matters, proposes compulsory voting for all eligible Nigerians. Joining us now this morning on Breakfast Central is Deputy Director of SERAP, Mr. Kolawole Oluwadare. Kola, a warm welcome to you and thanks for joining us in person this time around.
Thank you very much.
Good to see you. Now, your organization, SERAP, has described this bill as oppressive and unconstitutional. In what specific ways does it contradict both the Nigerian Constitution and international human rights standards? I mean, aren't you happy to have higher voter turnouts? Proponents of democracy says it strengthens democracy.
No, not necessarily. And that is why we need to look at these within the democratic context. That is why we have laws, primarily among which is the Constitution, that guides the conduct of everyone, including those that govern the citizens and those political office holders, whether they are appointed or elected. In this instance, what does the bill seek to achieve? Knowing fully well that under our laws, people have the right to participate in government and not to. It is a right. It is not an obligation. It is not a duty, as it were. And that is why Section 14 of the Constitution says that the right of people to participate in government is preserved. It does not make it mandatory. And don't forget, participation in government does not start and end with going to the polls every 4 years, or if you can, the off-cycle elections. It means being able to have conversations, including conversations like these, to call government to order, to hold government accountable. It would appear that what this bill wants to do is to compel people to vote, but deprive them of the other aspects of participation, which is what the National Assembly should be looking into, and not to compel people to vote. And this is against the backdrop of the realities that we've seen, that voter turnout has decreased over the years. Registration increased, but participation, the actual voting.
I mean, I guess that's what brought about this.
But this is not the right way to go about it, which is why I would believe that the National Assembly should look at the causes, which I'm sure they are aware of that voter apathy. It's not really, voter apathy is just a symptom. It is apathy of the people for not being able to participate in government. That is what has led to the voter apathy.
So now that you've said that this is an unconstitutional bill, are there ways in which this bill can be challenged? What is SERAP hoping to achieve with, asking them to withdraw it? What are the steps you're taking?
Ordinarily, this is just one step out of many that we believe SERAP has initiated. SERAP is just one of the civil society organizations in Nigeria. So the people ultimately have the power. What we expect the people to do is to speak to the various members of the House of Representatives to call them. What is their position on this? Because that is why they are there. They are answerable to their constituents. We have just ignited the spark, so to speak. The people are expected to take this up to ensure that that bill does not see the light of day.
And if it does go through, what will happen?
Of course, we said it clearly in our letter to the National Assembly. We will be compelled once again to go to court. This will become another public interest litigation, which it need not be. We would go to court if this bill becomes law, because the law allows people, any individual, to go to court to challenge the validity of a law in consonance with our Constitution, which is the ground law. And we will do that if this bill scales through, which I do not believe in.
There are also many other bills that were passed. I'm sure you're aware. Has SERAP taken time to go through these bills, because they seem to be so much? And aside from this one, which doesn't in any way give Nigerians freedom to choose whether they want to exercise their rights in terms of voting or they don't want to at all, would you say that the House and the Senate, would you say that they are taking it too far with these bills?
I think it's a case. When you look at some of the bills, not all, perhaps just some percentage of the bills being passed in both houses, like in this instance, it appears to be a case of misplaced legislative priorities. There are other burning issues of governance that affect Nigerians, and even those in the National Assembly, much more importantly, than trying to compel people to vote. And that is why the National Assembly must understand its roles within the concept of checks and balances. Some people will say the National Assembly is a rubber stamp. It doesn't mean the National Assembly has to fight the judiciary or the executive, but it means the National Assembly will pass laws and perform the oversight functions to ensure that the people benefit. In this instance, when you look at the whole thread of bills that have come out in the past few years, how do they benefit the people? And zeroing in on these particular one, this Amendment to the Electoral Act, which I believe there's another bill pending before the Senate, and I do hope it doesn't follow the same way. How does it benefit the people? It doesn't. In fact, it seeks to punish the people for what the government has been doing for them over the years.
Now, we have a tradition in this part of looking at global best practices and saying, you know, in saner climes that they've done this and it's worked well. Now, let's talk about saner climes. Australia, you agree with me, is a saner climb. Belgium is a saner climb. They've successfully implemented compulsory voting. Why does SERAP believe this won't work in Nigeria?
And I do agree.
I mean, people, it would wake up young Nigerians
Not
that are spending time on TikTok. They know you could pay a fine or go to jail.
They also
Spending time on TikTok is a freedom of expression.
them.
You are fair to do that. Not necessarily. I think we have 22 countries practicing mandatory voting presently. And I think about 10 or 12% of that, they are not enforced. Only a significant few enforce it, actually. But you need to look at our context. It is not just enough to say in saner climes, or in other that some people call it advanced democracies. We need to look at our local context.
What is our context?
How can we enforce these laws? The
don't even have
so-called
enough
many laws that we have they been enforced? We have the Freedom of Information Act. How well has it been enforced? How will it be enforced not to infringe on the rights of the people who may be perceived as not wanting to vote for a particular bloc or not? And that is what we need to look at. Again, we have to look at, does it have the capacity to handle the volume of people that will turn out to vote? Looking at the capacity of INEC and what INEC has done over the years. But I think, much more importantly, these countries, they started this mandatory voting because there was a context and a situation before they started. When we look at ours, will compulsory voting solve the problem of voter apathy? The question is a resounding no. So why should we do it?
All right. Speaking about the problem of voter apathy, which is what you said this bill seeks to solve. Well,
according to the bill.
According to the bill. Is there the bill can maybe be amended? You know how oftentimes we talk about certain bills not being completely thrown out?
Don't throw away the baby and the bathwater.
Is there a way that this bill could be amended to achieve the intended goal?
In this instance, save the baby. Don't kill the baby, but please throw the bathwater out entirely. There is nothing about this particular bill. Okay. And, you know, there are two bills we're talking about now. There is one before the House of Reps earlier this year, and then there is one last week before the Senate. We are not sure that the one before the Senate has these provisions, but we are concerned that it might, if not now, perhaps at all the other stages in the legislative process, which is why we need to talk now. It is not wrong to amend the Electoral Act. We do that from time to time, but it must be done looking backwards and looking forwards. What are the issues that arose from the last elections? How can we cure it? Is voter apathy the major issue that we have with the elections last year? What are the causes? And how can this law correct that? I do not think this particular amendment, I'm talking of the one amending 4 sections of the Electoral Act mandate and punishing people for not voting, is the right way to go. And that is if we look at the causes. Why don't people turn out to vote? It is because over time, people have seen that their views those in positions hold their views not to count. And that is why they do not turn out. And what about electoral violence? Just to give you a very good example. Last year, SERAP went to court in 2023, and last year, the Federal Court of Lagos, Honorable Justice Egwatu, gave judgment in favor of SERAP, compelling INEC to hold those who have been involved in electoral malpractice in 2023 general elections, including governors and their deputies, to account. The judgment is yet to be obeyed. Our lawyers had to file Form 47 and 48 as part of the contempt proceedings to compel the INEC chairman to obey the judgment until they brought subsequent processes to appeal that judgment. But that judgment is yet to be obeyed. And so what does that say about INEC? If you don't punish people who have done wrongly in the last elections, people have died and nobody gets punished, why do you want people to come out again and to vote? So to me, it's misplaced priorities. There are other things the National Assembly can do in amending the Electoral Act to make people participate more. What about the issue of electronic transmission of votes? That the court has given judgment that it's not mandatory, as it were. What about enforcing that section to ensure that it is mandatory? And then we see whether people would react well to it by turning out to vote.
Absolutely, because if you look at the cost Nigeria spends, especially on election, it's way higher than that of South Africa. But yet, South Africa has the public display screen where each member, be it of parliament, the public can actually monitor how the numbers are being calculated on the screen. But INEC, we know we use paper, and then there's a lot of cancellation and so on. But you did mention something in your the statement you made now. What do you think about the immunity that is being pushed, especially by the House of Representatives, that governors, of course, those in political offices would not have immunity anymore once they are out of office?
I think it's mainly for vice president.
Yes, vice president as well, but president has been exempted. What do you make of that? Because if that was implemented, I'm sure you will not need to file this case again to ask them to implement what was initially agreed in the Lagos courts here.
No, the way we are going about it in the suit that we filed was to look at a certain provision of the ICPC Act that allows the ICPC to bring up what is called a special counsel to investigate these issues. And that is also without prejudice to the provisions of the Electoral Act that gives INEC, the legal practitioners working with INEC, to prosecute electoral offenses. So it is not a matter that INEC does not have the capacity to do so. It is more of an unwillingness to do so. So when you link these to the immunity, as INEC come out to tell us that the investigations that INEC has done with law enforcement agencies has indicted governors and their deputies, and they are not able to arrest and prosecute them, we've not seen any action from INEC. So we cannot even say immunity is a problem. But let us agree, based on anecdotal evidence, that immunity is a problem. It's a good way to go. Particularly, and that's one of the recommendations to the National Assembly, when it pertains to electoral offenses, there should be no immunity for everybody, including the president. That's one of the things we suggested in our latest correspondence.
Well, is it not distracting to them? How would they go about governance?
Electoral offenses will be the worst form of democratic evil you can think of. It means that the mandate that got people in the office, it's not legitimate. And I would think that anyone, including the president, would want to clear the air about legitimacy first and foremost. Okay. Legitimacy is a core part of democracy.
Now let's talk about low voter turnout. It's often linked to a lack of public trust in the electoral process and the system. We looked at Senate crimes. Now let's look at the way we do things in Nigeria. I remember one time in Abuja when the Naira was going up against the dollar, the CBN thought in its wisdom that the best thing to do was to cut the trees where the Bureau de Change operators stand and exchange money. So in order to encourage voting, I mean, would we suggest, they say drastic calls go for drastic measures, that they ban street football on election day and Premier League? Or what other suggestions does SERAP have to encourage voluntary participation in the electoral process?
Thank you, Mega. In fact, we have 4 suggestions in the letter that we sent to the National Assembly, which are clear. They are no issues of morality. They are simple issues of law. You have said drastic measures. The drastic measures we would expect is on the part of those in public office, whether they are appointed or elected. In this instance, those in the National Assembly, to show example, show that they are willing.
What are those 4 suggestions you?
Tell them to drop the bill, to ensure that the Constitution is amended to remove immunity for every public office holder if it's an electoral offense, to ensure that past electoral offenses are investigated and properly dealt with, and to ensure that the Electoral Act is amended to give effect for encourage people to vote.
In what way?
To ensure that, for instance, the issue of electoral offenses, the punishments are clear and the law is clear, but INEC has not been up to the task to ensure that they're able to prosecute those who commit electoral offenses. And the National Assembly has the power as part of its legislative and oversight to do this. And this is much more important than compelling people to vote or sending people to jail because they've not voted. That's not. And I do not also agree that we need to ban street football or stop people from going online or do other activities.
Or watching Premier League on election. No. Especially Chelsea fans.
All right, let's wow, Chelsea fans have collected inside this innocent conversation. Let's talk about what precedents or what your concerns are as to maybe the dangerous precedents that the passing of this bill will set in terms of, and I would maybe randomly think about how it can be manipulated politically by people, to just throw people in jail. So what would you say from your standpoint are some of the dangerous precedents that the passing of this bill might set?
We have a lot of evidence for that in Nigeria. And with globalization, Nigeria is always quick to want to keep up with the international community. We ratify a lot of conventions, and we have laws that tend to keep up with international kind of best practices. The problem has always been the implementation. A very good example would be the Cybercrimes Act. When the act came out, it sounded lofty, it sounded good. It's even the wording sounded good. But look at the way it has been used since its enactment. It has been used by those in public offices and those who have influence to target those who deemed to be critical of government. And that is why it is very important that in making laws, and all Nigerians need to understand it to be able to advocate properly towards those in the National Assembly, it is not enough to make laws. There must be safeguards that ensure that in those laws themselves, and certainly in its enforcement, to ensure that the rights of the people are not breached. I do not think that features in the mind of those in the National Assembly when laws have been passed. It is just to pass a law because it's done like that in other climes, and because perhaps there's some kind of political pressure internationally to pass those laws. And that's why those laws must have safeguards that protect the people from inherent abuse, which we've seen with various laws. A very good example would be the Cybercrimes Act, which we've gone to court to challenge, by the way, and government is yet to enforce the judgment we got from the ECOWAS court.
You seem to have gotten a lot of judgments that haven't yet gotten enforcement. Can you run us through some of them?
There are lots of them. Unfortunately, most of them are yet to be enforced directly. When I say directly, it means government and the agencies involved are yet to respond. For instance, in 2023, we got judgment. It's funny that the bulk of these judgments arise from freedom of information request, which is just simply SERAP, as a citizen of Nigeria, asking for information. We had written a freedom of information request to the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and then the police to ask for, Minister of Finance, and Minister of Internal Affairs, how the loan we got from China then in millions of dollars was spent. And the loan was gotten to install security infrastructure in Abuja, CCTV and the likes. We didn't get a response and we went to court. 2 years of trial. And the court agreed with SERAP and mandated the Ministry of Finance to provide information as to how those loans have been spent. Up to today, that is yet to be obeyed.
So whose fault is that? Is it the court?
Exactly.
Whose fault is
It's
it?
not the court.
So where does the fault lie?
Someone has to take responsibility.
We're having conversations
So who has to take the responsibility? Because court has given judgment.
It is because the executive have practiced the art of impunity for so long that nothing gets done. And that is why it's very important to address impunity the moment it is either perceived or seen. I can go on and on about the several judgments we've gotten. What about the one we got last year? The Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs. Again, another freedom of information request. Simply mandating that ministry to disclose the details of the amount the ministry claimed it has spent on humanitarian affairs in the country. Again, 2 years of trial, the court gave judgment, it is yet to be obeyed. And these are simply
Doesn't
requests
that
for information.
discourage you and your organization from the advocacy and the work you do?
That's a very good question.
Because it's almost like, I mean, it's
Effort in
done
futility.
efforts in futility.
Do I look discouraged? No. But perhaps if you can rationally consider whether I'm going to be discouraged. Now, consider the Nigerian people who have seen most of these things over the years, and you can now understand what has led to the voter apathy. But because I'm doing my job and I understand it, of course, I'm not. If this bill scales through, next week, of course, it can't. You can be sure next week we are going to court.
All right.
We will not
Anyway.
be deterred.
Very interesting conversation. I'm sure we would have to buy out time to have you back because there's also the case of you also talking to the president concerning the River State issue. But that's a different, kettle of fish. We'd like to talk about that. Thank you so much, Kola, for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
It's
very
been a
much.
pleasure.